Chapter 1. Iron Tide. The sea beneath the Ravenwing wasn't blue, but the color of polished lead and old blood, drenched in the reflections of a gloomy, sunless sky. It didn't storm or rage, but merely heaved and heaved, like the chest of a sleeping giant whose slumber was filled with foreboding. The damp, salty air hung like a motionless shroud, clinging to his skin with a clammy chill. Einar stood on the prow of the longship, clutching the carved dragon's head, and felt every muscle in his body stiffen and numb from days of inactivity. He loved the sea, but this voyage was different. It didn't cleanse the soul, it weighed it down. He ran his palm over the rough wood of the ship's side, feeling traces of old resin and salt beneath his fingers. His gaze slid over the ship, this floating home and this weapon of war. The shields hung along the sides were ablaze with rain-washed colors. Wolves, ravens, dragons, symbols of past victories that now seemed like mere scraps of wood meant to ward off an invisible melancholy. The warriors, usually noisy and ready to laugh, sat silently, staring into the water or oiling their blades as if their lives depended on it. Perhaps they did. "Land!" a voice roared from the mast, breaking into a shrill, almost hysterical wail that broke the oppressive silence. "On the starboard side!" Einar peered into the milky gray shroud of fog that obscured the horizon. At first, he saw only a shadow, a blob of darker gray, like a bruise on pale skin. Then, the shadow took shape. High, sheer cliffs, black and wet, as if just rising from the seabed, crowned with wisps of low, swiftly drifting clouds. This was not the hospitable green coast of Scandinavia or flourishing Britain. This was the end of the world, forgotten by gods and men. Behind him, the ship slowly, reluctantly, came to life. Shields rattled, and muffled cries were heard, cheerless and lacking their usual daring. Jarl Hakon had awakened. He rose from his place by the mast, and his figure, mighty as an old oak, seemed to absorb all the meager light of day. His gray beard, braided in intricate plaits, lay against his chainmail, and his eyes, small and piercing as thorns, scanned the shore with the cold curiosity of a predator who has scented prey but cannot see it. "Finally!" His voice, hoarse from northern ale and the winters he'd lived through, thundered, but sounded flat, echoless, as if swallowed by the same ominous silence. "Have you eaten the sea, Odin's wolves? Are your hearts damp? Shake yourself! There it is, the new land! They say the monasteries there hold so much gold that anyone could forge golden fingernails. And the girls there, as rosy as the dawn." The belligerent roar that followed was little more than a grumble. Einar merely nodded silently, meeting the gaze of Ulf, his old friend, who sat at the oar. Catching his gaze, Ulf grinned and winked, but the same wariness, familiar to Einar, lurked in the corners of his eyes. They had both seen different shores, and not all of them had greeted them with bread and salt. Some shores had greeted them with silence, like this one, and that was always the worst sign. Einar walked down the center of the ship, stepping over the warriors' legs and leather packs. His gaze fell on a figure pressed against the side of the ship, close to the oars, next to the rower's bench. A prisoner. A Briton. A young man, his face as pale as parchment, the very reason he had been spared. His lips silently whispered prayers in a strange, melodious tongue. He wore a worn, faded robe, but his hands— Einar had noticed this even back then, during his capture. His hands were calloused, with strong, gnarled fingers, not the hands of a monk, but those of a craftsman, or even a warrior forced to wield a hoe. Einar remembered how they'd captured him in a ruined church on the outskirts of Northumbria. Smoke, screams, the clanging of steel. And this boy didn't fight, didn't try to run. He simply knelt before the charred altar, shielding a thick leather book with his body. This oddity had saved his life. Hakon found it amusing. "He'll come in handy," the Earl muttered then, looking at the shaking youth with a grin. "He'll be able to talk to the locals, since they don't understand our language. And if not, we can always sacrifice him to Odin. The wise god, they say, loves scholars." Einar squatted down next to the captive, disturbing his privacy. "What is your name, young man?" he asked in the broken language of the Britons. He flinched as if struck and looked up at Einar with wide eyes filled with bottomless terror. They held not only slavish despair, but also a different, deeper anxiety. "Eldred," he whispered so quietly that Einar could barely make it out. "Don't be afraid, Eldred," Einar said, not particularly kindly, but also not threatening. A simple statement of fact, like a shift in the wind or the approach of rain. "As long as you're useful, you're alive. Just remember the way. You'll speak for us soon." Eldred said nothing, only stared at the water again, as if trying to discern his reflection or his future in the dark, almost black depths. His fingers clutched the hem of his worn clothing. The Raven Wing was approaching the shore. Now, not just strips of pebbles were visible, but entire beaches of dark, wave-polished stone, with brown ribbons of seaweed covering the boulders like the tangled hair of drowned men. No lights on the cliffs, no smoke above the supposed farmsteads, no fishing boats on the water. Nothing that suggested life. Just stone, water, and the relentless looming fog. The ship's keel struck the shingle with a dull, mournful, grinding sound. The Vikings, as one, leaped from their seats, grabbing shields and axes, but their movements lacked their usual swiftness. Jarl Hakon was the first to step ashore, landing heavily on the ground, his chainmail clanking dully. He picked up a handful of wet, dark stones, sniffed them with the air of a connoisseur, and tossed them aside with a contemptuous grimace. "Nothing," he grumbled, his voice once again lost in the airless void. "It doesn't smell of anything. Not smoke from the fireplace, not animal manure, not human excrement. Empty, as if it had been licked clean." Einar followed. The ground beneath his feet was soft and muddy, and his boots sank into it with a squelching sound. He glanced at the coastline. The cliffs loomed like stern guardians, the mist drifting through the gorges, the silent, dark sea behind him, and the equally silent, gray land before him. Not a seagull's cry in the sky, not a trace of fox or deer in the damp sand. Only the wind, whistling in his ears, a haunting, lonely song that chilled his blood. "Build camp?" Bjarni, Hakon's son, blurted out heatedly, a young warrior bursting with health and a thirst for heroism. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Let's make fires and dry off." "No," the Earl snapped, his gaze fixed on a crevice in the rocks where a barely visible path led into the island's interior. "This shore, it's dead. But a worm might be hiding under a rock. We must find who lives here and explain to them who's boss now. Let's go, quickly." Einar felt a chill run down his spine, not from the damp wind. He looked at Eldred, who had been dragged from the ship and was now being pushed forward. The Briton stood huddled, shivering slightly. But he was looking not at the Vikings, not at his frozen feet, but inland, toward where the hills and valleys should have been beyond the wall of fog. And his expression was frozen with more than just the fear of a prisoner. there was something else, a sharp, almost physical premonition of disaster. "What?" Einar said shortly, coming closer. Eldred slowly, with difficulty, looked at him. His eyes were huge in his waxen face. "Silence," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Too quiet, even for the end of the world. Not a cry, not a call, nothing. Like a coffin." Jarl Hakon was already giving orders, forming his warriors into a marching column. Einar picked up his shield, feeling the familiar weight of the old wood and the cold iron shield boss. He looked once more at the empty, silent shore, the low, leaden sky, and the monk's pale face, distorted by the horror of the prophecy. They came for gold and glory. They came to conquer this land. But something ancient and cold, stirring deep within him, told Einar they had found something else entirely. Something that had been sleeping beneath this cold stone, and their arrival was the key that turned in the creaking lock, ready to release the darkness. Chapter 2. The Land That Doesn't Smell. A column of Vikings, about 40 men, stretched out along a narrow path winding between mossy boulders and stunted, wind-twisted trees. Their shields were slung across their backs, but their axes and battle-axes were held at the ready. They walked silently, listening. But the only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional curse from one of the brothers. Not from anger, but from the oppressive feeling of the silence itself weighing on them. Einar walked in the middle of the column, feeling the unnatural silence with every nerve. He was accustomed to the sounds of life in the forest, the chirping of insects, the singing of birds, the rustle of fleeing animals. Here, however, there was emptiness, dead, oppressive. The air was cold and damp, not fresh but musty, as if in a cave sealed for centuries. He saw some warriors involuntarily touch amulets bearing Thor's hammers or wolf's claws, their superstitious souls trembling in this anomaly. Eldred was pushed forward, closer to Jarl Hakon. The monk stumbled over the stones, his eyes seeming to take in everything, darting around, clinging to tree trunks, the outlines of rocks. He no longer prayed out loud, but his lips still whispered something silent. "I don't like this," Ulf said hoarsely, drawing level with Einar. He gestured to the ground beneath their feet. "Look, the path is well trodden, and not yesterday. The cart tracks are deep. People have been here, lots of people. And recently. Where have they all gone?" Einar nodded. This wasn't just an abandoned place. It looked deserted. Hastily, the path led up to the pass. From its summit, they finally saw the valley below. And the settlement. It looked more like a Norwegian farmstead than a British village. A few longhouses with turf roofs, low outbuildings, a cattle pen. And all of it was perfectly preserved. No smoke rose from the chimneys, but there were no signs of fire or destruction. It was as if all the inhabitants had simply vanished into thin air during their day. Jarl Hakon chuckled with satisfaction. "That's good. Look, we haven't suffered any hardships. Keep in line. Bjarni, with a dozen men, go ahead and inspect." The young warrior joyfully rushed forward, pulling the others along with him. Einar watched as they stealthily approached the first house, axes at the ready. Bjarni roughly kicked the door with his shoulder, and it creaked open. He disappeared inside, and a moment later ran back out, waving his arms. "Empty! No one!" His voice came, unnaturally loud in the silence. The Earl ordered them to move on. Upon entering the settlement, The Vikings dispersed, beginning to search the houses. Einar, Ulf, and a couple of others entered one of the long houses. The air inside was stale, smelling of old ashes, sour milk, and something else, sweetish and unpleasant, something Einar couldn't place. Everything was in its place. Wooden bowls on the low table, animal skin rugs on the earthen floor. Even a crudely carved wooden toy lay by the hearth. A jug stood on the table, and when one of the Vikings knocked it over, thick, moldy brew spilled onto the table. "It's as if they were called and left, abandoning everything," Ulf muttered, running his finger through the layer of dust on the table. No struggle, no blood, nothing. Einar approached the hearth. The ashes were cold, but not damp. He touched them. They were fine, like dust. This place hadn't been heated for several days, maybe a week. No more. Stepping outside, he saw Eldred. The Briton was standing in the middle of the street, peering not at the houses, but at their walls. He approached one of the pillars supporting the awning and ran his hand over the rough wood. "Einar," he called quietly. He approached. Eldred pointed to a dark, almost black stain pressed into the wood grain. It looked like dried mud, but its shape was strange, as if it had been scratched in by a finger, a sinuous line ending in a hook. "What is this? Paint?" "I don't think so." Eldred leaned closer, then pulled back abruptly, wincing. "It looks like blood, but old, very old. And this sign, I've seen something like it in manuscripts. It's an alchemical symbol, the sign of transfiguration, or decay." At that moment, a scream rang out from the other end of the village. Not a battle cry, but a short, abrupt shriek of terror, immediately swallowed up by the same insatiable silence. Einar and Ulf rushed toward the sound, drawing their weapons. They ran to a stone well at the edge of the settlement. Several Vikings stood around, pale and wide-eyed. One of them, a young man named Asketel, was on his knees, vomiting. "What happened?" Einar barked. One of the warriors, a gray-haired veteran, silently pointed into the depths of the well. Einar carefully approached the edge and peered in. The water below was dark, almost black, and floating on its surface were something he initially mistook for rotted leaves. But then his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw it. They weren't leaves. They were hair. And beneath them were pale, bloated faces. Several corpses, men and women, their eyes and mouths wide open, frozen in silent screams. But not from wounds, not from blows. Their skin was covered with the same black, twisting veins he'd seen on the pillar. "Lower! Look lower!" the veteran whispered. Einar peered closer. From the depths, just below the surface, more faces stared back at him. Dozens of them. The well was full of the dead. Jarl Hakon, coming up behind him, pushed Einar aside and peered into the well himself. He didn't flinch, only his expression hardened. "So not everyone left," he said hoarsely. "Some chose this." He stepped back, his gaze hard and suspicious. "This is witchcraft. Local witchcraft. We don't belong here." "Earl!" someone shouted from the distant houses. "There's a path here, a wide one. It leads to something big, on the hill." Hakon turned, looking away from the well, as if cutting off what he saw. "Okay, since there's no life here, let's go where it should be. In a castle or a fortress. There we'll find answers. And gold." He was already marshaling his warriors to move on. Einar remained standing by the well, feeling an icy heaviness in his stomach. He looked at Eldred. He was looking at the black water, and there was neither fear nor horror on his face. There was understanding, as if the pieces of a terrible mosaic had come together. "They didn't run away," the monk said quietly, turning to Einar. "They hid from something that came from outside, or woke up within." The hill's shadow loomed over the village, swallowing the last shreds of gray light. They were leaving this place of the dead, but Einar knew they weren't leaving fear behind. They were carrying it with them, deeper into the island, toward what this land had in store for them. Chapter 3. The Silence of the Stone. The path leading from the dead village was wider and better maintained, clearly the main artery connecting the settlement with what lay on the hill. The stones beneath their feet were tightly packed, and traces of drainage ditches were even visible along their edges. Each step upward toward the crest of the hill became increasingly difficult, not because of the steepness, but because of the oppressive feeling of climbing the back of some gigantic stone beast. No one said a word. Even Jarl Hakon walked with his jaw clenched, his gaze, usually wandering in search of prey, now fixed on the summit. Bjarni's laughter and bravado evaporated, replaced by a concentrated frown. They saw the well. They saw the empty houses. And now everyone understood. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. Einar walked, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back beneath his chainmail. He caught himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, peering into the shadows beneath the trees, into the piles of rocks flanking the path. He seemed to glimpse movement in the periphery of his vision, but when he turned his head, there was only a motionless gray rock. It was like a trick of the mind, but Einar knew that sometimes the mind can perceive what the eyes cannot. Eldred seemed to have completely forgotten his captive status. He walked beside Einar, his eyes feverishly gleaming, his lips silently repeating words. He looked not to the sides, but at his feet, at the stone path, as if reading an invisible book. "They didn't run," the monk suddenly spoke again, quietly but clearly, his words resounding like a hammer blow in the silence. "In the village. No bags, no bundles of belongings. They abandoned everything and came here. Or they were chased." "Who?" Einar asked shortly. "The one who drew these signs." Eldred pointed to another dark, barely noticeable symbol, a dent in the stone resembling 3 converging spirals. "It's a sign of concentration, a concentration of power. It leads—" The monk raised his head and pointed to the top of the hill. "There." Finally, they reached the ridge and froze. Loch. It didn't resemble the light British fortresses or the mighty stone strongholds of the Franks. It was a Norwegian fortress, a hurger, but dug into the rock of a foreign land. A high palisade of sharpened logs, massive gates, closed but unbarred. Beyond them, the roofs of longhouses and a watchtower. And all of this in perfect order and in perfect silence. No smoke, no flag on the tower, no sentries on the walls, not a single sound. "I swear by Odin's beard," whispered Ulf, standing shoulder to shoulder with Einar. Jarl Hakon studied the fortress for a few moments, his face a stone mask. "Nothing," he finally said. "Nothing again. This island is a ghost." He straightened up, and the fire of determination, mixed with greed, flared in his eyes again. "But ghosts do not build such walls or hoard treasures. They are gone. But they left behind what was theirs. Bjarni, the gate!" This time, the young warrior didn't rush headlong. He nodded, gathered a dozen of his most reliable fighters, and, locking shields, slowly approached the massive oak gates. They were unlocked. A gentle push, and the doors slid inward with a quiet, creaking groan, revealing a spacious courtyard. The Vikings poured inside like mercury, spreading out in a line, taking up defensive positions, scanning the corners. The courtyard was empty. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. The forge stood cold, iron blanks neatly piled nearby. Barrels lay scattered against the wall. One of them was overturned, leaking a dark, dried puddle of something that smelled like sour beer. "Search everything," Hakon commanded, his voice echoing off the log walls. "Every building, every crevice. I want to know what happened here." Einar, Ulf, and two other warriors moved toward the largest building, the ruler's house. The door was ajar. Einar pushed it open with his shield, entering with his axe at the ready. The room was spacious and richly furnished. Carved wooden columns, bear and wolf skins on the floor, a table laden with silver goblets, and wooden plates laden with dried, moldy scraps of food. It seemed as if the feast had been in full swing, and then suddenly, everyone vanished. "Don't touch anything," Einar warned quietly, but it was too late. One of the warriors, tempted by the silver goblet, reached out for it. At that moment, a child's wicker doll rolled out from under the table with a soft, rustling sound. The warrior flinched, recoiled, and knocked the goblet over. It fell to the floor with a dull thud, the sound like a gunshot. Everyone froze, listening. The silence that followed was deafening. "Damn island," the warrior cursed, picking up the goblet and tucking it into his belt. "Nothing but ghosts." Eldred, meanwhile, oblivious to the potential riches, approached the far corner of the hall, where a carved wooden chest stood on a stone dais, covered in equally familiar, strange symbols. It was unlocked. The monk carefully lifted the lid. There was no gold or jewelry inside. There were scrolls of parchment, vials containing some substances, small scales, and several metal instruments whose purpose Einar didn't understand. "The laboratory," Eldred whispered, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the top parchment. "The alchemist." He looked up at Einar, a mixture of horror and insight. "Einar, I was wrong. They weren't hiding. They weren't running. They became test subjects." At that moment, a scream came from the street. This time, it wasn't one of horror, but of triumph. "Jarl! The treasury! We found the treasury! It's full!" Shouts of joy and greed echoed through the fortress courtyard. Jarl Hakon was already running toward the sound, his face glowing. The warriors, abandoning caution, rushed after him. Even Ulf cast an uncertain glance at Einar. "Shall we go? Gold is gold." Einar shook his head, his gaze fixed on Eldred's pale face. "Go, I'll stay." Ulf nodded and ran out of the hall. Einar approached the monk. "What did you find?" Eldred handed him a parchment. It was inscribed with strange diagrams, intertwining lines and symbols, and in the center was a formula written in Latin. Einar couldn't read the language, but one word, repeated over and over, seemed to glow with an eerie light. Aeternitas. Eternity. He sought the elixir of eternal life. Eldred's voice trembled. "But look." He gestured to the margins, dotted with notes in Old Norse, obviously written later in a different, cruder hand. He was mistaken. He created not life, but its simulacrum, an elixir that does not animate the soul, but only compels the flesh to move, obeying the most primitive will. the will of the elixir itself, to spread, to infect. Einar looked at the diagrams, at the images of human bodies covered in those same black veins, and the chilling horror finally took on a name and a form. From the depths of the fortress, he heard the joyful cries of his kinsmen who had found gold. And he realized they hadn't found treasure. They had found a tomb. And they had just opened its lid themselves. Chapter 4. Gold and Dust. The screams from the depths of the fortress continued unabated, turning into a deafening roar of greed. Einar stood over the ominous parchments for another second, then decisively grabbed Eldred by the sleeve. "Let's go. They need to see this." They ran out of the ruler's hall and rushed across the courtyard toward a low, squat building of rough stone, a storeroom or arsenal. The door stood wide open, and torchlight poured through it, revealing the frantic, jubilant faces of the Vikings from the darkness. There was indeed gold inside. Not mountains, but enough to intoxicate the mind. Silver bars, rough but heavy. Copper bowls, jewelry with strange, local designs. The warriors grabbed everything they could carry, stuffing their sacks and tucking them into their belts. Jarl Hakon stood amid this chaos, holding a massive silver scepter in each hand, his face spread into a wide, victorious grin. "See, Einar?" he shouted, spotting him in the doorway. "See? Fear is for old women and monks. Prey is for warriors." "Hakon!" Einar pushed his way toward him, pushing aside the warriors, intoxicated by the discovery. "It's a trap! What happened here? It's not just a disease. It's the work of human hands. Alchemists!" "So be it." The Earl waved his hand, tossing one of the scepters into the pile. "His troubles died with him, and his gold is ours now." Eldred, trembling, tried to get a word in edgewise, holding up the parchment. "Sir, the formula, it's wrong. It creates not life, but a plague. It—" At that moment, a faint, barely audible groan came from a dark corner of the treasury. Everyone froze. The clanking of metal died away. The groan was repeated, dry, creaking, like two dry pieces of wood rubbing together. Bjarni, who was standing closest, frowned and stepped forward, raising his torch. "Who's there? Show yourself, ghost!" A shadow crawled out from behind a pile of empty barrels. At first, they thought it was an old man, so thin and hunched was he. His skin was a sallow gray, clinging to his bones, and his hair had fallen out in clumps. But when he raised his head to the torchlight, a stifled gasp of horror swept through the crowd. His eyes were milky white, pupilless, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. Those same ominous veins crawled down his neck and arms like black roots. "What's wrong, grandfather?" Bjarni snorted skeptically, but his hand reached for his sword. The creature, it was no longer human, didn't respond. It emitted the same creaking groan and suddenly lunged forward with unnatural, spider-like speed. Its movements were jerky and angular, as if its bones were not meeting at the joints. Bjarni, a seasoned warrior, instinctively jumped back and swung his sword. The steel whistled through the air and sank deep into the creature's shoulder. But there was no scream, no fountain of blood, only a dull, wet crunch. The creature didn't even flinch. It turned its blind head toward Bjarni and tried to claw at him with long, bony fingers. "What the hell?" Bjarni roared, snatching his sword. At that moment, from other dark corners, from behind barrels and chests, more similar figures rose up. Men, women. There were about 10 of them, all with the same whitish eyes and black veins. They moved silently, soundlessly, and their silence held a chilling terror. "To arms! Circle!" Einar roared, coming to his senses first. Chaos erupted in the treasury. The Vikings, who had just been treasure hunters, had become the prey. Axes and swords rained down on the creatures, but they seemed to feel no pain. They pressed forward, heedless of severed fingers or deep wounds on their bodies. One of the warriors, Askitel, the same one who had vomited at the well, retreated in horror and stumbled over a chest. 2 of the creatures pounced on him. Their thin but incredibly strong arms dug into him. He screamed, a piercing, childish sound, and the scream suddenly cut off. His body convulsed, and black, twisting lines crawled across his skin before everyone's eyes. "Fire!" Eldred cried desperately, pressing himself against the wall. "They're afraid of fire!" Ulf, standing nearby with a torch in his hand, hurled it without hesitation at the nearest creature. The tarred firebrand struck its chest, and its dry, almost mummified clothing burst into flames like oakum. The creature began to convulse silently, and a sound finally escaped its throat. Not a scream, but an indescribably eerie, hoarse hiss. It fell and ceased moving. It worked. The Vikings, coming to their senses, began retreating toward the exit, fighting back and setting fire to everything that would burn. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, the last creature was consumed. The treasury smelled of burning, charred flesh, and something sour and medicinal. The warriors stood, breathing heavily, in shock. Askitele's body lay on the stone floor. He was dead. But after a few moments, his fingers twitched, his head turned, and his eyes, still filled with the terror of death, began to cloud over with a milky white haze. "No," someone whispered. Einar, without a word, approached and brought the blade of his axe down hard on the boy's head. The sound was terrifying, but final. A deathly silence reigned in the treasury, broken only by the crackling of burning bodies and the heavy breathing of people. Jarl Hakon, still clutching the second silver scepter, looked at the charred remains. His grin had vanished without a trace. His face was gray as ash. What was that?" he asked hoarsely, addressing not Einar, but Eldred. The monk, pale but collected, took a step forward. "Consequences. The fruits of alchemical madness. The elixir didn't give them life. It made them vessels for itself. They're not dead. They're empty. And they want to fill this emptiness with the life that remains here. Ours." He looked at the pile of gold they were grabbing so greedily. "This isn't treasure. It's bait. We're trapped. And the walls of this fortress aren't protection. There are shackles." Einar looked at his brothers' faces. He saw in them not rage, not a thirst for battle, but an animal, primal fear. They had fought demons from myth, giants and spirits, but this was different. This was something that could not be understood, could not be respected. It was a void, devouring everything in its path. And they were now inside her. Chapter 5. First Blood and First Betrayal. The heavy silence in the treasury was thick as tar. It was broken only by the crackling of the burning remains and the heavy, whistling breath of the Vikings. The air had become poisonous, a mixture of burning, death, and that sweet, medicinal scent now associated with pure horror. Jarl Hakon slowly lowered his silver scepter. The glint of the metal now seemed mocking, He glanced at his warriors, pale, frightened faces, trembling hands clutching their weapons. He saw not an army of conquerors, but a herd of cornered animals. And this sight angered him more than any threat. "So," his voice was hoarse but commanding, trying to regain control. "Sorcery. Vile, but—" He kicked the charred hand of one of the silent ones. "Fragile. Fire and steel decide everything. Bjarni, Ulf, post guards on the walls. The rest of you, seal the gates, barricade all entrances to this hall. We will turn this fortress into a real fortress." The orders sounded confident, but found no echo in the warriors' hearts. Their movements were sluggish, lacking their usual energy. They carried out orders, but their eyes wandered, their gazes constantly turning to dark corners, to doors, anticipating a new attack. Einar watched this, his heart sinking. He approached Eldred, who was leaning against the wall, trying to decipher another parchment he had picked up from the floor with trembling hands. "What else?" Einar asked quietly. "Worse than I thought," the monk whispered, his eyes darting over the lines. "The elixir. It doesn't just infect, it adapts. Look." He pointed to the diagram. "The first subjects were slow, almost helpless. But the longer the elixir remains in the body, or the more fresh blood it consumes." Eldred swallowed. "The stronger and faster the host becomes. Those in the well, they were the first. And these," he nodded toward the charred corpses, "they were more perfect. And that old one, he may have been one of the last experiments. The alchemist himself probably fell victim to it. So, somewhere out there," Einar nodded his head towards the fortress, "there could be worse." "Yes, and they're probably not all locked in the treasury. They could have taken refuge in the dungeons. Or—" Eldred looked at the high walls. "They're already outside, waiting." At that moment, a cry came from the watchtower. "Movement! In the fog! At the foot of the hill!" Everyone rushed to the battlements in the walls. Einar ran up the ladder to the palisade and peered into the milky white shroud that enveloped the valley. At first, he saw nothing. Then, shadows. Dozens, perhaps more. They moved slowly, in a disorderly crowd, emerging from the mist like ghosts. They were the villagers. Men, women, children. Their clothes were tattered, their faces waxen masks with pale eyes. They walked silently, soundlessly, their feet dragging on the ground, but the direction was undeniable. Towards the fortress. "To arms!" Hakon roared. "They're scaling the walls!" But the creatures didn't rush. They simply approached the palisade and stopped. 100 blind eyes stared at the fortress's defenders and froze. Complete silence, broken only by the creaking of logs and the heavy breathing of the Vikings, hung in the air. This anticipation was worse than any attack. "What are they doing?" whispered Bjarni, standing next to Einar. "Why aren't they attacking?" "They're waiting," Einar replied, feeling an icy heaviness in his stomach. "They're not animals. Something drives them. Something intelligent." Night fell upon the fortress, black and impenetrable. The fog thickened, swallowing the figures at the walls, but everyone on the ramparts knew they were there. Still there. The torches lit on the walls illuminated only small pockets of darkness, behind which lurked something indescribable. Fear began to corrode discipline from within. A group of warriors, led by one of Hakon's brothers, a ferocious berserker named Scarf, approached the earl. "Hakon, this is witchcraft. We can't fight it. We have to break through to the ships, now!" "And fall into their jaws in the open field?" Einar objected, approaching. "In the fog? They'll cut us down one by one. We have walls here." "Fire! We have a grave here," Scarf barked, his eyes gleaming wildly in the torchlight. "You saw what they did to Acetel. I don't want to end up like that. We leave at dawn." Hakon looked at his warriors, divided by fear. His authority was crumbling at the seams. "We'll decide in the morning," he muttered, avoiding their gaze. "Right now, hold the line. Scarf on the eastern wall, Einar on the western." It was a delay, not a solution. A split was inevitable. Einar, Ulf, and Eldred were keeping watch on the western section of the wall. The night was cold, and their breath turned to mist. Suddenly, Eldred grabbed Einar's hand. "Listen." From the fog, at the foot of the wall, came a sound. Not a grinding or a groan, but a creaking. Metal on stone. Then, a dull thud. "They're doing something," Ulf whispered, growing wary. "Climbing?" Einar grabbed a torch and leaned out from behind the palisade. The flames lit the figures of the silent ones from the darkness. They weren't climbing. They were working. Several of them, the larger and stronger ones, were pounding the base of the palisade with a large stone they'd apparently found. Their movements were methodical, precise, devoid of any animalistic rage. Purposeful. "Spears!" Einar commanded. "Throw the spears!" Several spears flew down. One pierced the shoulder of one of the workers. He merely flinched, as if bitten by an insect, and continued his destructive work. They're smart," Eldred whispered in horror. "They're learning. Or someone's guiding them." Einar looked into the distance, toward where the ruler's castle should have been. At its very peak, near the watchtower, he thought he saw for a moment a tall, dark figure. Not hunched over like the others, but erect, motionless. Like an observer. Then, the fog closed in, and the figure disappeared. He turned to Ulf. "Find Hakon. Tell him we don't have time until morning. They're digging a tunnel, or breaking down the wall, or just waiting for us to go crazy." Einar's gaze fell on Eldred, and then on the inner courtyard of the fortress, where the entrance to the dungeon was dark, where, logically, the alchemist's main laboratory should be located. "We can't sit here," he said quietly. "We must strike first. We must find the source of this nightmare and destroy it. Otherwise, by morning, this palisade will be reduced to splinters, and all that remains of us will be a memory that will soon vanish along with those who hold it." He looked at the torch in his hand. The flame flickered in the wind, a small island of light and warmth in a vast, cold sea of darkness. But it wasn't enough. To survive, they would have to become fire themselves. Fire that would burn this damned island to the ground. Chapter 6. Descent. Einar's decision hung in the icy air. Even the fog seemed to freeze for a moment to hear it. Ulf looked at him with a degree of skepticism, but without surprise. They had fought side by side for too long. "In the dungeon," the old warrior hissed quietly. "Now, at night. Einar, even Odin wouldn't venture into hell without a reason." "Our reason is to survive until morning," Einar retorted, not taking his eyes off the dark void of the cellar entrance at the far wall of the fortress. "They're breaking down the wall. They're not just waiting, they're besieging us wisely. By sitting here, we're giving them time, and time, it seems, is on their side." Eldred nodded, his face in the torchlight like a saint in an ancient fresco, gaunt, yet animated by a strange determination. He's right. The elixir. It's not static. It evolves. The longer we wait, the stronger they become, and the closer they get to changing again. We need to find the lab, destroy the source materials, the recipes. Maybe that will weaken them. Or it will make him angry, Ulf said gloomily. Or both, Einar agreed. But it's the only way other than sitting and waiting for the wall to collapse. I'm going. I need you, Ulf. And you, Eldred. Your knowledge is our only light below. He turned to the rest of the warriors on the wall. Hold the line! Don't let them get to the wall! Shout! Make noise! Let them think we're all here! The descent into the basement of the main house was short, but every step on the slippery stone steps echoed in the silence, which was even more oppressive here than above. The air became thick and stale, smelling of damp earth, mold, and that same sweet chemical odor that was now associated only with nightmares. Ulf walked first, holding a torch in one hand and an axe in the other. Einar followed behind, covering the rear. Eldred was in the middle, clutching a rolled-up parchment like a talisman. The basement turned out to be more than just a storage room. It was the entrance to a dungeon system. Several low, dark arches extended from the main chamber, littered with barrels and junk, leading in different directions. Where to? Ulf asked, his voice echoing through the vaults. Eldred approached one of the arches and peered at the wall. A nearly faded but recognizable symbol. 3 spirals. This way. This is the sign that led us from the village. It leads to the spring. The tunnel was narrow, and they had to walk bent over. Drops of moisture fell from the ceiling like the tears of stone giants. Einar felt the cold penetrate his chainmail, but it wasn't the chill of dampness. It was the chill of the grave. They walked for what felt like an eternity. The tunnel began to widen, opening into a more spacious hall. Then, Eldred suddenly stopped, frozen in horror. "Don't move," he whispered. He lowered the torch, illuminating the floor. It was strewn with bones, but not human. These were animal bones, sheep, cows, dogs. They were all unnaturally white, as if bleached, and twisted, as if they had been wrenched from their sockets with great force. And among them lay scraps of hide, but there was not a shred of flesh on them, as if the creatures had devoured everything clean, leaving only bare, gnawed bones. They eat? Ulf kicked the sheep's skull away in disgust. No, Eldred's voice trembled. They don't eat. They absorb. The elixir requires life force to sustain bodies. Animals, people, anything that contains even a drop of energy. It doesn't saturate itself. It only grows. At that moment, a sound came from the darkness ahead. Not a creak or a groan, but a slurping sound. A wet, disgusting slurping sound mixed with the crunching of bones. Ulf slowly raised the torch higher. In the far corner of the room, something large and dark clung to the shadows. It was one of the creatures. But it was larger than the others, its back covered in strange bony growths, like armor. It squatted over the carcass of a horse. Its long fingers easily tore through the thick hide and muscle tissue, shoving shreds of flesh into its lipless, constantly working mouth. The sound was terrifying. The creature sensed the light. It slowly turned its head. Its whitish eyes were larger than the others, and a dull, greenish glow seemed to float within them. It didn't hiss. It growled low, like a beast. And that growl was far more terrifying than any hiss. "Back!" Einar commanded, retreating toward the tunnel. Slowly. But it was too late. The creature, with a roar that shook the walls, lunged forward. It moved not with the spider-like speed of the first, but with the power and fury of an enraged bear. Its body, reinforced with bone plates, seemed to fear nothing. Without thinking, Ulf hurled the torch at her. The flames struck her chest, but only bounced off, scorching her carapace without igniting it. This only enraged the monster further. "Run!" Ulf shouted, jumping back and raising his axe. Einar pushed Eldred into the tunnel and rushed to his friend's aid. His axe whistled down on the creature's hand. The blade sank into a bony growth, and a deafening crack echoed. The creature roared and sent Ulf flying back into the wall. He fell heavily, groaning. Einar, left alone with the monster, retreated, fighting back. His axe was nearly useless. The blow to the head had only left a deep scratch on the bone helmet that protected his skull. He knew they were losing. "The head! Get the head!" Eldred shouted from the tunnel. Einar made a desperate lunge, aiming for the neck under the armor. The axe sank into the flesh. What spurted from the wound wasn't blood, but a thick, pitch-black liquid. The creature howled and grabbed the axe shaft, tearing it from Einar's hands with inhuman strength. And at that moment, Ulf, mustering his last strength, rose. He didn't attack. He simply rushed forward and grabbed the creature from behind, pinning its arms, exposing his side to its claws. "Run, Einar!" he roared. "Complete the mission!" Before Einar could react, Ulf lunged forward with his last strength, pushing the roaring monster toward a deep, dark fissure in the hall floor they hadn't noticed. They both, locked in mortal combat, vanished into the black hole. Their fall was drowned out by a single, brief, and terrifying sound from below. A wet, bone-crushing crunch. Einar froze, unable to move. The air was driven from his lungs. A friend, a brother, died to save him. "Einar!" Eldred's cry was full of despair. "They're coming! Follow the sound!" A creaking rumble, ever increasing, came from the side tunnels. Dozens, hundreds of steps. Einar, speechless with grief and rage, obeyed instinct. He snatched up the fallen torch, extinguished but still smoldering, blew on it, and, grabbing Eldred's hand, rushed forward, through the hall, past the fissure, into the next tunnel, marked with the same ominous symbol. They ran without looking back, hearing the growing rumble of pursuit behind them. They reached another stone arch. Beyond it, a faint, flickering glow could be seen, and the sound of murmuring water could be heard. Einar paused for a second, catching his breath. His hand clutched the hilt of his knife, all he had left. He looked at Eldred. Eldred looked at him with horror and understanding. They entered. And what they saw made them forget about the chase, about the pain, about the loss. The cave was enormous. Its vaults were lost in darkness. In the center, a spring of water gushed from a crevice in the stone, but the water was opaque, milky white, and emanated a pale, phosphorescent light. Around the spring, the same substance splashed in stone vats. And on a stone table in the center lay tools, vials, and a body, in dark, decayed clothing, clutching a silver staff tipped with a huge crystal. An alchemist. But that wasn't the worst part. The cave walls were covered in something, like giant wasp nests. But instead of clay, it was compressed flesh, bone, and those same black veins. And in these nests, like ripe, horrific fruits, hung dozens of silent ones' bodies. They didn't move. They were ripening. And in the farthest corner of the cave, on a stone throne, sat the same tall figure Einar had glimpsed from the wall. Her pale eyes were open and stared straight at them. In one hand, she held a roll of parchment, the final recipe. In the other, she clutched and curiously examined an amulet in the shape of Thor's hammer, torn from the chest of one of the Vikings who had arrived with Einar. She wasn't blind like the others. Her gaze was meaningful, hungry. Eldred recoiled, leaning against the wall. "The progenitor," he whispered. "He didn't just become infected. He evolved. He controls them. All of them." Einar picked up his extinguished torch. There was no flame, only the charred end remained. He looked at the source, at that white, glowing poison that was the root of all evil. He looked at the creature on the throne, which slowly, with regal majesty, began to rise. They had found the source of the nightmare, and now they had to either destroy it or become part of it forever. Chapter 7. Source of Darkness. The world narrowed to the cavern, to the shimmering white spring, to the figure rising from the throne. The air hummed with a silence louder than any scream. Einar felt every beat of his heart, heavy, desperate, like a hammer striking an anvil. His fingers gripped the extinguished torch so tightly that the wood creaked. The progenitor. He was tall, almost twice Einar's height. His features still retained a semblance of human, but they were distorted, elongated, like clay sculpted by a madman. His skin was a grayish pearlescent tint, and not black, but dark purple. Almost living veins ran down his arms and neck, pulsing in time with the flickering source. His whitish eyes were not blind. A cold, intelligent glow swam in them, studying, calculating. He didn't attack. He watched. And his gaze held not an animalistic desire to kill, but something more terrifying. The curiosity of a scientist examining a new, interesting specimen. "He sees us," Eldred whispered, pressing himself against the wall. His voice was filled not only with fear, but also with a kind of painful, scientific awe. "He's not just a carrier, he's a master. The elixir hasn't suppressed his mind. He's merged with it." The progenitor slowly raised the hand holding Thor's amulet. He turned it over in his long, slender fingers, as if trying to comprehend its meaning. Then his gaze shifted to Einar, to his extinguished torch, to his stance of readiness for battle. He seemed to smile. But there was no smile, only a slight movement of the skin at the corners of his disfigured, lipless mouth. From behind him, from the dark crevices in the walls, others began to emerge. Silent ones. Dozens of them. They didn't attack, but simply stood in a semicircle, cutting off any escape route. They were his guards, his army. "Eldred," Einar said quietly, through clenched teeth, not taking his eyes off the progenitor. "The source. How can we destroy it?" "I don't know," the monk's voice trembled. "Fire might not affect the water itself. We need to collapse the cave, seal the spring." "Excellent. And how do you think we'll do that?" Einar's voice tinged with bitter irony. At that moment, the progenitor took a step forward. He didn't walk, but rather hovered above the floor, his movements unnaturally fluid. He made a sound, not a roar or a groan. It was speech, but not human. Guttural, clicking sounds, like the cracking of breaking ice and the hiss of boiling resin. Sounds that grated on the ears and made one shudder. And in response to this sound, the silent ones stirred. Not to attack. Two of them broke away from the crowd and slowly walked not toward Einar and Eldred, but toward one of the stone vats filled with white liquid. They scooped it up with their hands and, returning, began slowly, almost ritualistically, pouring this substance over the base of one of the nests on the wall. "What are they doing?" Einar whispered. "They feed them," Eldred realized with horror. "They tend them. Like bees tend a hive. These nests, they're not just cocoons. They're incubators for new, improved versions." The progenitor made its chilling clicking sound again. This time, its guards turned their heads toward Einar and Eldred. Their pale eyes lit up with a dim but unified light. The order had been received. They moved forward, slowly, without haste, tightening the circle. Einar looked around. There was nowhere to retreat. Behind him lay only a dead-end section of the cave. His gaze fell on the alchemist's body on the table, and on the staff with the crystal he clutched in his hand. The crystal glowed faintly from within, with the same white light as the source. "The staff!" he shouted to Eldred. "You said it concentrates power? Perhaps it can release it too?" Eldred, blinded by fear, seized upon this idea. "Yes, theoretically, yes. Alchemical wands are used to focus etheric energies. If you point it at the source..." But getting to the staff meant passing through the progenitor and his guards. Einar did the only thing he could. He threw his extinguished torch straight into the face of the nearest silent one. He merely jerked his head, but it created a split-second delay. Einar lunged forward, not for the staff, but for the stone table filled with instruments. His hand grabbed the first vial he could find, containing a cloudy brown liquid. He hurled it at the group of guards. The glass shattered. Liquid splashed on them. And nothing happened. The progenitor made a sound like a dry, silent laugh. Despair began to creep up Einar's throat. He retreated, shielding Eldred, who was backing toward the wall in terror. They were pressed against one of the nests. Sticky, pulsating flesh was right behind them. And then Eldred cried out. Not from fear, but from sudden insight. He looked at Thor's amulet, still clutched in the progenitor's hand. "Life," he breathed. "They consume life, but something sacred, sanctified by faith, pure, unblemished life. It can be poison to them." Einar didn't understand alchemy, but he understood symbols. Thor's amulet was a symbol of his world, his gods, everything that was dear and alive. The progenitor took another step. He was already several feet away. His long, bony hand reached out to Einar, not to strike, but to touch, to examine. And at that moment, Einar saw his reflection in those bottomless, whitish eyes. He saw not a warrior, but the last shred of living, resisting flesh in this realm of dead, animated matter. He rushed forward, not dodging, but heading towards. It was so unexpected that even the progenitor froze for a moment. Einar didn't try to strike. He slipped under the outstretched arm and, like a British thief, snatched Thor's amulet from his fingers. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The progenitor didn't scream. He let out a piercing, high-pitched screech that made his ears ring and his skin prickle. He recoiled, clutching his arm. Smoke billowed from where his skin had touched the amulet, and his flesh blackened, as if charred. "He's afraid of him," Einar cried, clutching the amulet in his fist. He felt the wood and metal burning in his palm, but it was the heat of life, the heat of rage, the heat of hope. He turned to the nest behind him and pressed the amulet hard into the sticky, pulsating flesh. There was a sound like the hiss of hot iron dropped into water. The nest shuddered. The black veins around the amulet darkened even more and began to crumble to dust. The flesh shriveled, and one of the bodies inside twitched helplessly and went silent. The guards paused. Their connection with the progenitor had apparently failed. They stared at the smoldering wound on the wall with mute bewilderment. The progenitor straightened. His whitish eyes narrowed. There was no longer curiosity in them. There was a cold, boundless fury. He emitted a new, commanding, clicking sound, and from every crevice, from every tunnel leading into the cave, a growing rumble could be heard. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a grinding sound, the scraping, clawing sound of hundreds of bodies struggling toward them. Every silent one in the dungeons, every one at the fortress walls responded to their master's call. They had no more time. Einar looked at Eldred, then at the staff in the alchemist's hand. The path to it was now open, but behind the progenitor's back. "Distract him!" he shouted to Eldred. The monk, gathering all his will, grabbed a piece of bone from the floor and threw it at the progenitor. "Look at me, you fiend!" he screamed in Latin. "Your creation is an abomination before God!" The progenitor turned his head, and at that moment, Einar lunged toward the table. His hand reached for his staff, but the progenitor was faster. He didn't pursue Einar. He simply swung his long arm. And from the very source, from the white glowing water, a thick, serpentine tentacle of the same substance erupted. It struck Einar in the chest with a sharp sound, throwing him away from the table. Einar crashed into the wall, and the world went dark. He felt the cold, a freezing, piercing cold, spreading from the impact across his chainmail, penetrating it. He tried to rise, but his body wouldn't obey. He saw the progenitor slowly turn toward him, his hand rising again to deliver the final blow. And at that moment, a deafening roar rang out, and Bjarni burst into the cave, bloody axe in hand. Behind him were several more Vikings, their faces distorted with rage and horror. "Einar! The wall has collapsed! They're everywhere!" Chapter 8. A Cry of Rage and Despair. Bjarni's roar wasn't a cry of fear, but a howl of pure, unfiltered rage. He burst into the cave, his bloodied axe slicing through the air in deadly arcs, scattering the silent ones who tried to block his path. 5 more Vikings burst in behind him, the last ones holding the main gate. Their faces were covered in blood and dirt, their armor was mangled, but their eyes blazed with the fire of the doomed, determined to take as many enemies as possible with them to Valhalla. "Jarl!" Bjarni roared, his gaze briefly catching on Hakon's body lying at the cave entrance, his head crushed and dark veins already creeping up his neck. His rage reached boiling point. "Beast!" Without thinking, he rushed at the progenitor. It was suicidal, but it served as a distraction. The progenitor's long arm, poised to finish Einar, paused. The creature spun to meet the new threat. It easily deflected the savage blow of Bjarni's axe and responded with its own move, swift as a cobra's strike. Its fingers, hard as steel, dug into Bjarni's shoulder, piercing his chainmail. Bjarni roared in pain, but didn't retreat, clinging to the monster's arm with his free hand. The remaining Vikings locked shields, trying to hold back the onslaught of the guards, who, having come to their senses, rushed into battle. A chaotic, furious battle ensued in the center of the cave. The clanging of steel, the crunching of bones, the death rattles, all of it blended into a deafening, hellish chorus. Eldred, taking advantage of the moment, ran up to Einar. "Hold on!" He tried to lift him up. Einar recoiled, his face pale, his lips blue. He clutched Thor's amulet with one hand, pressing it to his chest, where a dark stain remained from the blow of the white substance. The stain hadn't cleared, but Einar was shaking as if in a fever. Don't touch me." His voice was hoarse. It's inside, cold. I can feel it, touching me, with my thoughts." Eldred looked at the amulet and understood. The sacred symbol held back the infection, but it couldn't banish it. It was burning away like a buffer, and time was running out. His gaze fell on the alchemist's staff lying on the table. An idea, wild and desperate, took shape in his mind. "The wand, it focuses the elixir's energy. But if you direct it at the source, charging it with something opposite, something that brings not eternal life, but sacred death." He looked at the amulet in Einar's hand, at his readiness to sacrifice, and at his own faith. At that moment, one of the Vikings covering them fell, struck down by 3 silent ones. Their circle closed. Bjarni, bleeding profusely, still fought the progenitor, but it was a battle between an elephant and an ant. The progenitor toyed with him, parrying his blows and leaving fresh, bleeding wounds on the warrior's body. "Monk!" Bjarni roared, jumping back from another blow. "Do something, damn it!" Eldred lunged for the table. This time, the progenitor, preoccupied with Bjarni, didn't stop him. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal of the staff. The crystal at its tip glowed brighter, as if sensing his touch. Eldred felt a strange energy, cold and alien, run up his arm. "Einar, amulet!" he shouted. Einar, mustering all his willpower, rose to his knees. His hand trembled, but he hurled the amulet across the cave with all his might. Thor's wooden mallet arced through the air and fell at Eldred's feet. At that moment, the progenitor finally ended the game. His hand whistled through the air and pierced Bjarni's chest, tearing out what had been thrashing within just a second ago. The young Viking froze, his eyes wide open, his expression frozen not in surprise, but in rage. Then he collapsed, limp. The progenitor turned to Eldred. His entire demeanor no longer expressed curiosity, but absolute, undivided anger. He let out a piercing, multi-layered screech that shook the cave walls. All the silent ones froze, and then, as one, rushed toward Eldred. The monk had no time for rituals. He picked up the amulet, pressed it to the crystal on his staff, and, closing his eyes, recited the only prayer he could think of. Not in Latin, but in his native, ancient language, words his pagan grandmother had taught him before he entered the monastery. Words addressed to the force of life, to the sun, to the spirit of nature. Let light swallow up darkness, and life, death. He pointed his staff at the spring gushing from the ground. Nothing happened. The progenitor took a step, the grin on his face widening. Despair gripped Eldred. He'd been wrong. It was just a stick. And then he understood. The staff was a guide, but he needed strength, not faith as an abstraction, but life. Real, passionate, human life. He looked at the dying Einar, at himself, and at the approaching progenitor. He unfurled the staff and, without giving himself time to change his mind, thrust the pointed end of it forcefully into his chest. The pain was blinding. He screamed, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of triumph. The staff's crystal, stained with his blood, flared with crimson light. Then the crimson collided with the white within the crystal, causing it to glow with a blinding golden radiance, like a tiny sun. A beam of pure solar light, warm and vibrant, struck from the crystal directly into the milky white source. There was a deafening crack, as if the sky itself had burst. The source exploded. The white substance boiled and turned into black steam. The light faded. The cave was plunged into darkness, broken only by the cracking of breaking stones and the furious, dying howl of the progenitor, whose body began to smoke and crumble like dust. The cave's vaults began to collapse. Giant stones fell from the ceiling, crushing both the silent ones and the remnants of the Vikings. Einar, mustering his last strength, crawled to the spot where Eldred had fallen. He found him in the darkness by his hoarse breathing. The monk was still alive. The staff was still embedded in his chest, but the light from the crystal had faded. "Go," Eldred whispered. "Run. You must. Warn." Einar didn't listen. He tore the staff from his friend's wound, hoisted him onto his shoulder, and, stumbling under a hail of falling rocks, dragged him toward the tunnel they'd come through. Behind him, the last of the silent ones ran, falling, and perished, their connection to the progenitor severed, their bodies returning to their true, inanimate state. He didn't look back. He ran. Through the darkness, through the rumble of the collapsing mountain, through the pain and cold within him. He ran, carrying the only person who understood what had happened here, and the only proof of their nightmare, the alchemist's wand, which he instinctively clutched in his bloodied hand. He had to reach the ship. He had to warn his people, and he had to hope that the curse remained buried beneath these stones. But deep down, feeling an icy weight in his chest, he knew this was only the first battle, and the war was only beginning. Chapter 9. The Price of Ashes. The escape from the dungeon became a blurry nightmare, woven of pain, darkness, and the roar of the world collapsing behind him. Einar, barely able to feel his body, moved on instinct alone, dragging Eldred's nearly lifeless body. He stumbled over bones, over stones, over the bodies of the fallen, both his brothers and those who had perpetrated this horror. The air was thick with line dust and the acrid smoke of the burning flesh of the silent ones, who, having lost their connection with the progenitor, were frozen in place, slowly smoldering like damp logs. He didn't remember how he'd reached the surface. The first breath of cold, foggy air burned his lungs. The night was still dark, but a dirty gray streak of dawn was already visible in the east. The fortress presented a grisly sight. The palisade had been broken in many places, the gates had been torn out, and in the courtyard lay piles of bodies, both Vikings and silent ones, merged in a single, posthumous brotherhood. It was quiet. There were no more clicking sounds, no more creaking. Only the wind whistling through the shattered gates. Einar lowered Eldred to the ground by the wall of the main house. The monk's hand twitched convulsively, and he let out a quiet, hoarse sigh. He was alive. Miraculously. "Hold on," Einar whispered, his own voice strange and broken. We got away." He looked around. No movement, no sound. He was alone. The last of those who had entered this accursed fortress with Jarl Hakon. Somewhere in the depths of the collapsed cave lay Ulf and Bjarni. Here, on the stones of the courtyard, lay dozens of others, He felt a sickening weakness and leaned against the wall. The cold in his chest, where the white substance had struck him, didn't go away. He felt it constantly, an icy, dead scar on his living flesh. Thor's amulet, which he had clutched in his fist, now felt like nothing more than a piece of wood. Its power seemed to have faded, having fulfilled its final mission. Einar forced himself to his feet. He found an overturned barrel of rainwater by the well and wet a rag to clean the wound on Eldred's chest. The wound was terrible, but the bleeding seemed to have slowed. Perhaps the staff itself had cauterized it somehow. Einar tore a cloak from one of the fallen warriors, tore it into strips, and made a semblance of a bandage. As he worked, his gaze fell on the alchemist's wand, which he had hastily tucked into his belt. The metal was cold, the crystal cloudy and dull, but it was tangible evidence, proof that all this was not a nightmarish delusion. With dawn came the need to act. He couldn't stay here. He found several leather flasks in the ruined blacksmith shop, filled them with water, and collected the remaining crackers and dried meat from the bodies of the fallen. The bag was pitiful, but it was all he had. He fashioned a stretcher from 2 spear shafts and a cloak, carefully lifted the unconscious Eldred onto it, and, taking hold of the ends, dragged him through the broken gate and down the hill. The journey to the shore was another ordeal. The fog cleared, revealing a desolate land. The village below stood just as silent, but now its emptiness was different. There was no ominous threat, only the hopeless, melancholy silence of oblivion. He walked all day, stopping only to give Eldred a sip of water. His own body screamed in pain, and the icy patch on his chest seemed to drag him down to the ground. He saw hallucinations, shadows moving in the bushes, heard whispers on the edge of hearing. This wasn't the plague. It was its echo, a scar left on his soul. By evening, he finally saw a strip of sea and, with a jolt, a lone drakkar, still pulled up on the shore. The Raven Wing, their journey home. But as they approached, hope gave way to anxiety. There was no one near the ship, no sentries, no sign of a camp. He pulled the stretcher closer and froze. The ship stood empty. Abandoned sacks and a few overturned shields lay scattered on the sand around it. And bodies. 5 Viking bodies. They weren't torn apart. They lay as if asleep. But their skin was pale, and familiar veins were visible on their necks and faces like black cobwebs. Einar understood. The plague wasn't limited to the fortress. It had come here too. Perhaps one of those who had fled the breached wall was already infected. Or something else. Something that had arrived with them. Cautiously, axe at the ready, he approached the ship and climbed aboard. No one was there. Only the wind blew across the empty rowers' benches. In the hold, he found supplies, barrels of water and food, enough to get him home, to civilization. He climbed back down, lifted Eldred aboard, and laid him under the awning at the bow. Then, through pain and exhaustion, he began preparing the ship for departure. Alone. A job designed for 20 men. He pushed the crow wing into the water, his muscles burning and his ears ringing. He raised the sail, and the wind, as if taking pity, filled it. The drakkar slowly pulled away from the shore. Einar stood at the helm, looking at the island as it receded. It was gray, lifeless, like ash. Nothing betrayed the hell raging within. He felt not relief, but a heavy, leaden emptiness. They had sailed for glory and fortune. They had found death and madness. He was the last the last witness. Eldred groaned in his sleep. His life hung by a thread. Einar placed his hand on the cold spot on his chest. He had survived. But he wondered, at what cost? And what exactly had he brought with him from that damned island? Just a memory? Or something more? The Ravenwing glided over leaden waves, bearing him into the unknown, away from the land of terror, and perhaps toward a new nightmare, one he carried in his blood and in his cargo. The surviving monk and the alchemist's staff that lay at his feet, silent and ominous, like a sleeping snake. He was the last Viking of Hakon's company, and his saga was not yet over.